The first time Evelyn Whitmore saw her family's manor, it was through a curtain of rain so thick it seemed the sky itself was trying to drown the land. The carriage wheels sank deep into the mud, the horses snorting as though reluctant to go any farther. And there it stood, Whitmore Manor, its black spires cutting through the mist, its windows flickering faintly with the dull glow of lanterns that no living hand had lit. The journey to Whitmore Manor began long before Evelyn's carriage ever left the village road. It began with a letter sealed in black wax, delivered on a morning when the mist had refused to lift from the moors. The handwriting was thin, elegant, and unmistakably old-fashioned, as though written by a hand that had not belonged to this century. It spoke of her inheritance, an estate, long abandoned, awaiting its rightful heir. No mention of the whispers that had followed the Whitmore name for generations. No mention of the disappearances, or the children born under the manor's roof who never lived to see adulthood. Only a simple instruction, chilling in its brevity, *return home*. Evelyn had not thought of the Whitmores as home in years. Her mother had forbidden the subject, refusing to speak of the family or the manor after fleeing it in her youth. When Evelyn was a child, she'd caught her mother staring into the firelight late at night, whispering prayers beneath her breath. Once, she had heard her mutter that no one should ever go back to that place, that the land itself was cursed. But Evelyn had grown into a woman of reason. She had studied in the city, built her life among logic and light, far from the rural folklore that haunted her lineage. The letter had stirred something she did not want to admit, a curiosity sharpened by inheritance and blood. The journey took 2 days through roads that grew narrower, the woods crowding closer with every mile. By the second evening, the air itself seemed to change. It grew heavier, laden with the damp scent of moss and something older, something metallic, like rust or blood. The coachman grew restless. He did not speak much, only crossing himself when the trees grew too still, their twisted limbs reaching overhead like darkened ribs. When the storm broke, it was sudden and violent. Rain lashed against the windows in sheets, and thunder rolled in the distance with a sound that seemed to rise from beneath the ground. Through the blur of rain and fog, Evelyn caught her first glimpse of the manor. For a heartbeat, she thought it a trick of the light, a jagged silhouette against the sky, too tall, too angular to belong to any house built by sane hands. But as the carriage turned the final bend, it came into full view, and she felt something cold crawl down her spine. The spires rose like blackened fingers, sharp against the pallid moonlight. Vines coiled over the stone walls, thick and dark as veins. Windows gleamed faintly through the rain, each one flickering with a dull amber glow, though no fire should have burned there. The air grew colder, and even the horses began to resist, their hooves striking the earth in nervous rhythm. The road ended at the gates, tall, wrought iron, their design intricate yet grotesque. Each bar was twisted into shapes that seemed almost human, faces contorted in silent screams. The coachman hesitated before speaking. "This is as far as I go, miss," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "They say the house doesn't take kindly to strangers." Evelyn forced a smile, though she felt her pulse quicken. She stepped down into the mud, the rain soaking through her cloak in seconds. "I am not a stranger," she replied, though the words tasted strange on her tongue. The gate creaked as she pushed it open, the sound echoing like a groan across the grounds. Beyond it, the path was overgrown, lined with weeds that clawed at her skirts. The manor loomed ahead, vast and ancient, its walls breathing shadows. Every step closer felt heavier, as though the earth itself resisted her approach. The rain had softened into a mist now, but the air was thick with a silence that pressed against her ears. She could hear nothing, not the wind, not the birds, not even the rain's gentle hiss against the roof. She reached the front doors, massive things of oak and iron, scarred with age. Carved into their surface was the Whitmore crest, half-worn and barely legible, a serpent coiled around a crown. Evelyn hesitated before knocking. Her reflection stared back at her in the warped brass of the knocker, a pale face framed by wet curls, eyes wide and uncertain. For a fleeting second, she thought she saw another reflection behind her, a shape in the mist, tall and still. When she turned, there was nothing but the courtyard and the whispering fog. The doors opened before she could touch them. A gust of cold air swept over her, carrying with it the faint scent of dust and decay. A single lantern burned in the entrance hall, its flame wavering weakly. Evelyn stepped inside, her boots echoing against the marble floor. The silence deepened, thick and watchful. Portraits lined the walls, the faces of long-dead Whitmores staring down from gilded frames. Their eyes were painted with unnerving clarity, and though she knew it was an illusion of light, she could not shake the feeling that they were following her every move. She removed her gloves, trying to still her trembling hands. The air inside the manor felt colder than the storm outside. Her breath came out in faint clouds, and somewhere in the distance, a clock began to chime, slowly, deliberately, as though marking her arrival. She tried to recall the last record she had read of the Whitmore family, the final heir before her mother had disappeared sometime in the 1890s, his body never found. The manor had been sealed since. How, then, could a lantern burn? Her voice sounded small in the vast hall. "Is anyone here?" The question hung unanswered. Only the soft flicker of the lantern replied, casting her shadow long across the floor. And then, faintly, she heard it, the sound of movement above her. Slow, dragging footsteps across the upper corridor. She froze, straining to listen. The steps stopped abruptly, as if whoever, or whatever, was there had realized she was listening. Her heart thudded in her chest. She told herself it was the old house settling, the creak of wood and time. But deep within, a cold awareness unfurled, a sense that she was not the first to stand where she stood, that the house remembered others who had crossed its threshold and never left. The portraits watched as she turned slowly toward the grand staircase. A draft stirred the edges of her cloak. Somewhere in the shadows above, something shifted. The caretaker appeared then, emerging from the far corridor with a lantern of his own. His steps were slow, his expression unreadable. His face was pale, worn like paper left too long in the sun. "You've come home," he murmured, as though the words were not a greeting but a sentence. The flame in his lamp flickered lower, casting strange shadows over the walls. Evelyn managed a weak smile. "You must be Mr. Grayson. My letter said you'd be here to receive me." His eyes, watery and pale, fixed on her with a hollow kind of pity. He said. "I've been here longer than I should have been. They told me someone would come, but I didn't think." His voice trailed off, his gaze drifting toward the portraits, then back to her. "The house doesn't like to be empty." The storm outside deepened, wind rattling the windows in their frames. Evelyn looked up toward the darkened staircase, her curiosity battling the rising unease that gripped her chest. Something in this place had been waiting, she could feel it in the floor beneath her feet, in the whisper of the wind through the rafters. The air trembled faintly, like breath. And when thunder rolled again, echoing through the vastness of the manor, she could almost swear she heard the faintest whisper carried within it, soft, deliberate, and impossibly close. Her name. The storm did not pass that night. It lingered around the manor as if unwilling to move on, its rain lashing against the windows with relentless persistence. Evelyn had taken her supper in the dining hall, a vast chamber lined with mirrors and portraits, though neither gave her comfort. The caretaker, Mr. Grayson, had brought her food without a word, his eyes avoiding hers as though afraid to look too long. When she had tried to ask him about the state of the house, why it still seemed so well kept, who maintained the lights, he had merely said, "Some things in Whitmore Manor tend to themselves." The answer had not comforted her, but exhaustion dulled her curiosity for the moment. The storm outside felt like a presence pressing against the walls, and by midnight, she could bear the oppressive stillness no longer. She rose from her chair, her footsteps echoing across the marble, and began to wander the corridors with a candle in hand. The manor revealed its secret slowly. The corridors seemed endless, looping through halls lined with old furniture draped in sheets, doors that led nowhere, and staircases that twisted into darkness. Every sound felt amplified, the faint drip of water, the whisper of her dress brushing the floor, the creak of wood beneath her boots. She paused at one point, convinced she heard another set of steps behind her, soft and deliberate. When she turned, the corridor was empty, but the flame in her candle trembled violently, as though disturbed by a breath that did not belong to her. It was then that she noticed the door. Tucked behind a heavy curtain at the far end of the upper gallery, it was unlike the others, smaller, older, its surface carved with faintly discernible shapes. She brushed the dust away, revealing what looked like vines winding upward toward a single emblem at its center, the serpent and crown of the Whitmore crest. The handle was cold, almost wet to the touch, and when she tried it, it refused to turn. Locked. She leaned closer, pressing her ear against the wood. For a moment, she thought she heard the faintest sound from within, a rhythmic flutter, like the beating of wings. Then silence. Curiosity outweighed fear. She searched along the doorframe and found a keyhole hidden beneath a rusted plate. "Mr. Grayson," she whispered to herself, recalling the ring of keys he carried at his belt. He had said nothing of any locked rooms, yet something about this door felt different. It seemed to breathe faintly beneath her fingertips. She stepped back, the candlelight trembling against the carvings, and for an instant, she thought she saw the faint impression of faces in the wood, distorted, straining outward, their mouths open as if mid-scream. She blinked, and they were gone. The next morning, she confronted Grayson about the room. He had been tending to the fireplace in the drawing hall when she entered, his expression weary but alert. "There's a locked door on the upper gallery," she said. "Behind the curtain." "What is it?" His hand froze mid-motion, and for a heartbeat, the only sound was the pop of the fire. "Best not to trouble yourself with that room, Miss Whitmore," he muttered, poking at the embers. "It's not meant for you." "Not meant for me," she echoed, incredulous. "It's part of my house." He gave a slow, hollow smile. It's part of it, but not all doors are meant to open. Especially not that one." She pressed him, but his lips thinned, his eyes fixed on the hearth. When she turned to leave, he added quietly, "If you value your sleep, don't go near that place after dark." Of course, the warning had the opposite effect. That night, when the house sank into its peculiar silence and the candles burned low, Evelyn found herself back in the gallery. She had taken the caretaker's key ring earlier when he had gone to fetch more wood, and now the keys jingled softly in her hand as she stood before the locked door. The storm had subsided, but the air was still heavy, and somewhere in the distance, she heard what sounded like the faint humming of a tune, a lullaby, old and broken. She found the right key on the 5th try. The lock clicked open with a slow, grinding sound, and the door gave way with a reluctant sigh. The smell hit her first, dust, oil paint, and something else beneath it, something faintly sweet and rotting, like old flowers left too long in the sun. She stepped inside, holding her candle high. The flame cast trembling circles of light across the room, and her breath caught in her throat. Every wall was lined with portraits. Dozens of them. Men and women, children and elders, all bearing the same sharp Whitmore features, pale eyes, thin mouths, and an expression that was neither quite sorrowful nor serene. Their frames gleamed with gold, though many were tarnished with age. But it was not the number of portraits that unnerved her. It was the precision of them. Each one looked alive. The eyes in the painting seemed to follow her. Wherever she moved, their gaze trailed her like a slow, invisible current. She walked to the center of the room, her candle flickering wildly now, and examined the largest painting. It depicted a man seated in a high-backed chair, his hands folded neatly over a cane, his gaze direct and unyielding. Beneath the frame was a small brass plaque, Lord Ambrose Whitmore, 1841. She had read of him in her research, the patriarch who had built the manor as it stood today. He had died mysteriously, as had his children, his wife, his servants. Yet here he was, staring at her with eyes that seemed to gleam wetly in the candlelight. She turned slowly, taking in the rest. Some of the faces she recognized from faded photographs, others were unfamiliar. But when she reached the far wall, her heart stopped. A large, uncovered canvas leaned against the wall as though waiting to be hung. She stepped closer and felt her knees weaken. It was her. Her own likeness, rendered with uncanny accuracy, the curve of her jaw, the fall of her hair, even the faint scar near her temple. The signature in the corner read the same as the others, *A, Whitmore. But she had never sat for a portrait. Her candle sputtered. A chill crawled down her back. For a moment, she thought she heard a whisper, soft, raspy, like dry leaves scraping across stone. The flame dimmed, and shadows rippled across the painted faces, their eyes glinting faintly. She stumbled backward, nearly dropping the candle. The air had changed, it felt thick, suffocating. The door behind her creaked open wider, though she had not touched it. As she turned to flee, her gaze darted once more to the unfinished portrait of herself. The face on the canvas was no longer still. The lips had parted slightly, as if about to speak, and the painted eyes gleamed with something wet and human. Evelyn gasped and stumbled out into the corridor, slamming the door behind her. For a long moment, she pressed her back against the wood, breathing hard. The candle had nearly gone out, its weak flame trembling against the darkness. And then, from inside the room, came the faint sound of brushes dragging against canvas, slow, deliberate strokes continuing their work long after the painter should have died. Sleep came to Evelyn only in fragments. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a silence more unsettling than the thunder. In that silence, the manor seemed to breathe. The wind no longer howled, but faint murmurs drifted through the walls like sighs pressed into the wood itself. When she closed her eyes, she heard them, a tangle of whispers threading through her dreams, calling her name in tones both pleading and familiar. By morning, the voices had not faded, they clung to her consciousness like mist, following her through every corridor. The air inside the manor was colder now, sharp enough to bite through her gloves, and though she lit fires in every room she entered, the flames never seemed to warm her. Mr. Grayson had grown more withdrawn, refusing to meet her gaze. When she asked him about the room of portraits, he merely shook his head. "Best not to linger there," he said, his voice cracking. "The house remembers too much already." Days passed in uneasy repetition. Evelyn explored the manor by habit, seeking distraction from the voices that whispered through the floors at night. She found locked trunks in the attic, yellowed letters sealed with wax, and books that crumbled when she opened them. Yet one thing continued to disturb her above all else, the sound that came from beneath her feet. It began softly, an almost imperceptible hum, like a faint vibration through the floorboards. At first, she thought it was the wind trapped in the old pipes or the scurrying of rats in the cellar. But soon, it grew into something rhythmic, deliberate, a low murmur that rose every night after midnight and ceased at dawn. Sometimes it sounded like chanting. Other times, like crying. On the fourth night, she could bear it no longer. Candle in hand, she descended the main staircase, her slippers making no sound on the cold marble. The air was thick, oppressive, and the house seemed to darken around her. The whispers grew clearer the closer she came to the east wing, the part of the manor Mr. Grayson never entered. The hallways there were lined with doors warped by damp and age. At the end stood a narrow passage half hidden behind a rotting tapestry. She brushed it aside, revealing a narrow archway and a descending stairwell that spiraled into darkness. The air that drifted up from below was colder still, heavy with the stench of damp stone and something else, something faintly metallic. Her candle flame wavered as she stepped down, the walls pressing close on either side. The further she went, the louder the sounds became, not quite whispers anymore, but soft, echoing breaths, rising and falling in an eerie rhythm. Her pulse quickened. She told herself it was the house settling, the echo of wind trapped beneath the foundation. But then she began to hear words, faint and broken, as if carried by a chorus of unseen mouths. Her name again. Evelyn. Drawn forward by equal parts dread and compulsion, she reached the bottom of the stairs and found herself in a vast, subterranean chamber. The room was circular, its walls lined with stone arches that disappeared into shadow. The floor was covered in a thin layer of water that mirrored the faint light of her candle. The air was thick with decay, yet beneath it lingered a sweet, cloying scent, like wilted roses. At the far end of the chamber stood something that should not have been there, a chapel. The pews were carved from dark wood, warped and damp. An altar stood at the center, its surface cracked and stained with what looked like old, dried blood. But it was what lay behind the altar that made Evelyn's breath catch in her throat. Along the curved wall, built into the very stone, was a row of coffins. There were dozens of them, each fitted into its own niche, their lids marked with brass plates bearing names she recognized: Ambrose Whitmore, Catherine Whitmore, Jonathan Whitmore. Generations of her family entombed beneath the house, their resting place secret, hidden from history. Some of the coffins were centuries old, their wood blackened with rot. Others appeared newer, disturbingly so. Evelyn stepped closer, her candle trembling in her grasp. She traced the nearest brass plate with her finger, reading the inscription through the dust. The date was wrong. It was recent, too recent. She swallowed hard and moved to the next, then the next, her fear mounting with every name. Each was a Whitmore, and each bore a date far later than the last recorded generation. And then she saw it. Near the end of the row, half buried in shadow, was a coffin unlike the others. The wood was pale, untouched by age, the brass plate gleaming as though newly polished. Her hand shook as she brushed away the thin film of dust. The inscription read her own name. Evelyn Margaret Whitmore. Below it, the date. The day she had arrived at the manor. Her mind stilled, emptying of thought. For a long moment she could not move. The whispers rose again around her, no longer distant but circling her, curling in her ears like breath. Welcome home. She stumbled backward, the candlelight throwing wild shapes across the walls. The water rippled around her feet, and somewhere in the darkness, something shifted. She turned her head sharply toward the sound, heart hammering. The nearest coffin creaked faintly, the lid trembling as though something inside had stirred. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of earth and decay. She backed toward the stairwell, her mind screaming to run, but her body frozen by terror. From beneath the altar came a faint scratching sound, slow, deliberate, the sound of fingernails dragging across stone. The whispers grew louder, layered over one another until they became a low, mournful chant. The candle in her hand flared suddenly, its flame stretching unnaturally tall before extinguishing completely, plunging her into blackness. She could hear them now, close, impossibly close. The shuffle of movement, the wet sound of something dragging itself across the floor. Her pulse roared in her ears as she groped blindly for the staircase. Her fingers brushed against cold stone, then caught on something softer, fabric, human skin. A voice whispered inches from her ear, soft and fragile, as though from behind a veil, "You shouldn't have come." She stumbled, falling to her knees in the freezing water, scrambling for purchase in the dark. Her hand struck something solid, the base of the altar. Her fingertips brushed against carvings she hadn't seen before, symbols gouged into the stone in circular patterns. They pulsed faintly with warmth, a heartbeat beneath her hand. The whispers twisted into a single voice, low and resonant, filling the chamber like an echo of the earth itself. "You belong here. Asterisk." With every ounce of strength she had, she pushed herself upright and fled toward the stairwell. Her foot struck the first step just as the sound rose behind her, a loud crack, like splintering wood. She did not look back. She climbed, gasping, her hands clawing at the slick walls. The air seemed to close around her, thick with the weight of unseen eyes. When she finally burst into the hallway above, she slammed the door shut and collapsed against it, her heart battering her ribs. The whispers were gone, swallowed by silence. But as she caught her breath, she realized the silence was not complete. From below, faint and distant, came a single sound, the slow creak of a coffin lid closing. Morning came grey and hollow, the light bleeding weakly through the manor's tall, dust-choked windows. Evelyn did not sleep. The image of the coffin with her name on it haunted her every time she closed her eyes. The whispers that had chased her up the cellar stairs seemed to linger still, faintly echoing through the walls, as though the very stones remembered the sound of her fear. She found herself sitting at the long dining table, untouched breakfast laid before her, the silverware dull with tarnish. Mr. Grayson entered quietly, his movements as cautious as a man approaching a grave. He did not ask where she had been or why her nightgown was still damp at the hem. Instead, he poured her tea, his hands trembling so slightly she almost missed it. She studied him in silence, noting the pallor of his face, the weariness in his shoulders. He had been the caretaker since before she was born, or so the villagers said. But there was something wrong in the way he carried himself, as if the house itself had leached something from him over the years. Finally, she spoke, her voice quieter than she intended. "There's a chapel beneath the manor." The porcelain cup in his hand clattered against the saucer. For a long time, he didn't look at her. Then, slowly, he said, "So, you found it?" His tone held no surprise, only resignation. She felt a chill ripple through her as she asked, "What is it? Why are there coffins with the names of my family, and mine?" He set the cup down and turned toward the window. The light cast his face in a cold pallor. "This house was never meant for peace," he murmured. "Your ancestors made sure of that." Evelyn frowned, her fingers tightening on the edge of the table. "What do you mean?" Grayson's gaze remained fixed on the fog outside, as though afraid of the answer himself. "The Whitmores built their fortune on blood," he said at last. "Not the kind spilled on battlefields or through cruelty of hand, but through promises, the kind that stain generations. It began with Lord Ambrose Whitmore, your great-grandfather's grandfather. He believed the land was cursed, that it demanded tribute. He was right, but it wasn't the land, it was what he invited into it." Evelyn's heart thudded once, hard. He invited something. Grayson turned then, his pale eyes hollow but certain. He called it a pact. A way to keep the family's wealth and legacy eternal. The Whitmores had begun to lose everything: plague, famine, madness. Ambrose built this house atop older ground, where something ancient had already been buried. He made his offering there, in the chapel you found. The room seemed to grow smaller as he spoke, the air pressing close. "What kind of offering?" Evelyn asked, though dread already whispered the answer in her mind. "Blood," he said simply. "A life for prosperity." The pact bound every Whitmore born after him. The house became the vessel of it, feeding on those within its name. It remembers each of them. Their faces. Their fears. That is why it never truly empties. Evelyn felt her throat tighten. That's impossible. You're talking about superstition. Grayson gave a sad, brittle smile. So thought many before you. And yet none who bore your name ever left this place alive after returning. Your mother was the only one to escape, but even she could not rid herself of it. When she died, the house called again, waiting for another Whitmore to answer. He took a slow step toward her. You were never meant to inherit. You were meant to replace. Her pulse quickened. Replace? He nodded. The pack demands a Whitmore. When one leaves or defies it, the blood must renew. The house hungers. It keeps their spirits to feed itself until the next comes home. That's why the portraits shift, why the coffins bear fresh names. The house writes its own record. Evelyn's hands trembled as she stood. You're saying this place is alive? Alive enough to remember, he replied. Alive enough to want. She turned away, pacing toward the hearth, trying to drown the words with the sound of her own breath. And you, why stay? Why serve a house like this? Grayson's silence stretched long before he answered. Because I made my own bargain, he said, his voice low. Ambrose chose me, my family, to keep the manor's doors open, to tend it, to feed the illusion of care. The house doesn't touch us directly so long as we obey. But it watches. It waits. And it reminds. He raised a trembling hand to the side of his neck, and for the first time, Evelyn saw the faint traces of symbols burned into his skin, the same ones carved into the altar below. Her stomach turned. You've kept this secret for years, she whispered. You knew what would happen to me. I hoped you wouldn't come, he said, his eyes lowering. But the letter was not from me. The house sent it. The same way it calls the lanterns to light when night falls. The same way it paints what has not yet happened. A sudden draft stirred through the hall, snuffing the candles near the window. The fire hissed and dimmed. Evelyn's reflection in the glass flickered, and for a moment, she saw not her own eyes staring back but another's, darker, hollow, endless. She turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. What if I leave? She demanded. What if I walk out those gates and never come back? Grayson shook his head slowly. You won't make it past the woods. The house doesn't let its chosen go once it wakes. She wanted to laugh, to deny him, to tear the front doors open and prove him wrong, but deep down she already knew the truth. Since the first night, the air beyond the gates had felt heavy, watching. The fog in the woods had moved like a living thing. Even the horses had refused to come closer. She was bound, not by choice, but by blood. Grayson's lantern flickered as he moved toward her. There is a way, he said softly. Every generation, one of them tries. To end it, to burn it, to free the house from its hunger. But it always fails. The fire dies before it touches the heart of the manor. The heart, she whispered. He nodded. The altar below. It isn't stone. It's the root of what Ambrose summoned. The house is built around it. If it burns, the curse might end, but so will you. Evelyn stared at him, the weight of the revelation pressing down until it was hard to breathe. She thought of the portraits watching her, of the coffin carved with her name, of the whispers that called to her from beneath the floorboards. Somewhere, beyond reason, she felt the truth of his words like a pulse in her veins. The house was not merely haunted, it was hungry, sentient, bound to her blood. Grayson turned away, lifting his lantern. If you mean to fight it, you must do it before the next moon. After that, the house will take what it's owed. And it will not stop until you are part of its walls." As he disappeared down the hall, the faint echoes of his footsteps faded, and Evelyn was left alone with the sound of her heartbeat and the soft, almost affectionate whisper that seemed to rise from the cracks in the floor beneath her feet. It spoke her name like a promise, gentle and patient, as if the house itself were smiling. The night had deepened into a silence so complete that even the wind dared not move through the hollow corridors. The candles Evelyn had lit were nearly spent, their wax melted into pale puddles upon the floor. The manor seemed to breathe around her, the air shifting and pulsing faintly, as if drawing her into its lungs. Each shadow on the wall seemed alive, trembling and stretching toward her with unseen fingers. Her hands trembled as she held the lantern, its light dim and uncertain. She could hear the faint beating of her own heart, but beneath it, deep beneath the floorboards, something else throbbed, slow and rhythmic, like the pulse of something vast and waiting. She had come to the end of the corridor where the great doors to the ballroom stood open. The air beyond them was thick with the smell of soot and decay. The crimson curtains stirred without wind, brushing softly against one another like whispers exchanged between the dead. As she stepped inside, the sound of her shoes echoed, hollow and strange. The grand chandeliers above hung crooked, their crystal ornaments glinting faintly in the dull light of the lantern. The once polished marble was cracked and discolored, marked by black veins that spread across it like rot through flesh. In the center of the ballroom, the caretaker waited. Mr. Grayson looked smaller than before, frail beneath the wavering glow. He held a candle in his trembling hand, his face a pale ruin of grief and resignation. "It's time," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "You know now, don't you? What this place demands." Evelyn stared at him, her lips parted, unable to form words. She did know. Every piece of the manor's mystery had gathered in her mind, and the truth it shaped was monstrous. Her ancestors had fed this place. They had given blood to keep their wealth, their name, their immortality intact. Every wall, every stone, every inch of decayed splendor was built not just with mortar and sweat, but with souls. And now the debt had come for her. "You can't run," the caretaker whispered, stepping closer. "No Whitmore ever has. The house finds us all." His candle flickered wildly, then extinguished. Evelyn took a step back, clutching her lantern to her chest. "Then it ends tonight," she said, her voice trembling yet fierce. "I will not be part of this." The old man looked at her sadly, his eyes wet with something beyond pity. "You cannot end what was never meant to die." Evelyn's lantern flared briefly as she turned and fled from the ballroom. Her footsteps pounded against the marble floors as she ran through the hallways, the portrait staring down at her with cold, unblinking eyes. She could feel the manor shifting around her, the doors changing places, corridors stretching longer, ceilings rising higher. The air itself seemed to twist, forcing her back toward the heart of the house. Somewhere above, the sound of shattering glass echoed, followed by the unmistakable murmur of many voices whispering in unison. Her name drifted among them, soft and tender, as though spoken by loved ones long dead. She reached the grand staircase, panting, her lungs burning. The air was thick with smoke now, though no fire yet burned. She stumbled toward the study where she had left the matches, her mind wild with one desperate thought, to burn it, to destroy it all before it could take her as it had taken the rest. The door to the study creaked open slowly, as if welcoming her back. Inside, the room was cold, the fireplace dark and filled with ashes. The portraits on the walls had changed, the faces of her ancestors were gone, replaced with shadows of her own reflection, staring back at her from every frame. Her hands shook as she struck the first match. The tiny flame hissed to life, its light fragile but defiant. She dropped it upon the curtains, watching the fire catch slowly, hesitantly, before spreading upward in jagged lines. The smoke coiled around her like breath from unseen lungs. The flames climbed the walls, reflected in 1,000 glass eyes. She ran through the manor, throwing burning rags against the drapes, the carpets, the wooden banisters. The air grew hotter, heavier, but the fire refused to spread as it should. The wood sizzled, blackened, and then healed, closing over the flames like flesh knitting itself whole. The house groaned deeply, the sound rolling through the walls like thunder beneath the earth. The floor beneath her feet began to tremble, dust falling from the ceiling in soft showers. She screamed in frustration, tearing at the floorboards with her bare hands, as if she could rip the curse out by force. Beneath the boards, the ground pulsed like living skin. The light from her lantern flickered violently, casting monstrous shadows on the walls that seemed to move independently of her. They twisted and swayed, forming outlines of figures, Whitmore ancestors, standing in silence, watching her burn their legacy. Evelyn stumbled backward, choking on the smoke. She turned toward the staircase, but something blocked her path. The caretaker stood there, his face gaunt, his eyes empty. "It won't let go," he said softly, his voice hollow. "It never lets go." She could see now that his skin had taken on the ashen hue of the walls, that his fingers were no longer flesh but brittle wood. He was part of the house, another soul absorbed into its structure. She cried out his name, but he only smiled faintly, a ghost of sorrow crossing his lips before he dissolved into dust. The floor split open with a deafening crack. A rush of hot air burst forth, carrying with it the stench of rot and something metallic, blood, old and thick. Evelyn fell to her knees, clutching the lantern. From the gaping wound in the floor, she could see the black abyss beneath the house, writhing with faint, glowing embers that pulsed like veins. The sound of whispers grew louder, more urgent, their words merging into a single command, *stay. She rose slowly, her face streaked with soot and tears. "No," she whispered. "No more." She hurled the lantern into the open wound. It shattered, and for a moment there was silence. Then a roar unlike anything human filled the manor. Fire erupted upward in a column of blinding gold, consuming the walls, the ceilings, the portraits. The manor shuddered, screamed, and the fire spread, no longer resisted. Evelyn stumbled backward, shielding her face as the world became flame. Outside, the villagers saw the glow rising through the fog, painting the sky crimson. They said the ground shook for miles, that the old Whitmore manor burned for 3 days and nights. When they came to the ruins, they found no body, no trace of Evelyn Whitmore. Only the blackened outline of the house, standing amid the ashes, its charred doorway still open, as if waiting for someone to return. And when the wind passed through the hollow remains, it carried a sound faint and familiar, a whisper curling through the smoke. It spoke her name, soft and loving, like a promise. *Evelyn.